The dust hadn't yet settled from the morning's shame when Jude Carter rode into town on a sway-backed mare that hadn't eaten properly in 3 days. The saddle squeaked with every breath she took, and his boots dangled loose in the stirrups, untied and mud-caked from a night he couldn't remember. The bottle in his coat was empty, though his mouth still tasted of copper and rotgut whiskey, and he carried the slumped air of a man who once held something good and buried it with his own hands. Main Street watched him come the way it always did, without kindness. No words, just glances half hidden behind storefront windows and lace curtains, behind the whitewash of decency and wagging tongues. Men turned back to their cigars. Women tightened their shawls. Somewhere, a dog barked as if to say he's back, and no one needed to ask from where. He didn't know what drew him toward the auction yard. Maybe it was the hunger in his belly. Maybe it was the sound of a hammer cracking wood, the preacher's voice gone raspy from calling out numbers and names. Maybe it was just the feel of coin in his pocket, the last silver piece from a game of cards he'd cheated his way through. One coin, cool and round, rubbed between his fingers like something alive. The yard smelled of sweat, dung, and burnt beans. The sun was cruel, branding shadows down from the gallows frame of the auction platform, where 6 girls stood in silence, backs straight, heads bowed. Most wore dresses too thin for decency, patched at the knees or missing sleeves entirely. One had a sack tied over her head. Another clutched a Bible to her chest as if it were armor. $6, someone called out, slurring the word with laughter. Hell, I spend more on salt. The men standing near the corral gate chuckled, teeth yellowed, some missing. Jude dismounted without a word. His boots hit the dirt with a dull sound like something falling out of place. He didn't look at the girls. He didn't need to. They weren't people anymore. Just shapes against the light. That's how it worked when men lost the part of themselves that remembered women were born screaming and bleeding just like them. Looking for a cook, Mr. Carter? Drawled a voice. Jude glanced sideways. Emmeline Rose stood beneath a striped parasol, her eyes hard beneath their powder. Or a ghost to chase off the rats? He didn't answer. He never did when her voice came dipped in sugar and rust. The auctioneer, a man with bad lungs and a worse mustache, struck the wood post again. Next up, this one here, he said, nodding toward the girl tied to the rear wagon post. Bit scrawny, but she works. Doesn't talk none. Maybe that's a blessing. The crowd snorted. The girl didn't move. She was barefoot. Mud clung to her ankles, and her wrists were bound with coarse rope that left welts so raw they seemed to pulse with each breath she took. The sack over her head hung limp in the heat, but the shape beneath was delicate, too small for a grown woman, too narrow for comfort. Jude felt the coin in his pocket again. It burned now. Start the bidding at $6, the auctioneer muttered. No one spoke. The wind blew, lifting dust into the eyes of the sheriff leaning against the post nearby. Sheriff Buck Hollis didn't blink. Just stared at the tied girl like he was measuring guilt. Jude licked his cracked lips. 6, he said. The words dropped like stones into the dirt. Heads turned. Sold, the auctioneer rasped too quickly, desperate to move things along. She ain't worth, someone began, but Emmeline Rose gave them a look that silenced complaint. Jude stepped forward. The girl didn't lift her head. Sign here, the auctioneer said, sliding out a scrap of paper and a shaking pen. Jude scrawled something that looked more like regret than a name. Then he walked over and cut the rope himself. Her arms fell to her sides like wilted branches. Still she didn't speak. He reached out to guide her, but she flinched at his touch. Jude swallowed. He led her to his horse and, without saying a word, helped her into the saddle. The mare balked at the smell of her, or perhaps at the stillness of her silence, but settled with a grunt. As they rode out, a little girl on the fence rail whispered, "Mama, why's that one crying through the sack?" Jude didn't turn. But the wind did. And he heard it, faint, fragile, the sound of breath broken like glass. The ride back to the ranch was long and wordless. Jude didn't drink. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. Something about the way her body swayed behind him, how she clutched the saddle horn with hands too small, too scarred. Something about it made his throat dry in a new kind of way. The ranch looked worse than he remembered it. Roof caved in one side. Door hanging limp like a broken jaw. The porch sagged under time and weather. Weeds had swallowed the garden. No smoke from the chimney. No chickens in the yard. Just ghosts. He dismounted, held the horse steady while she slid down without help. Her legs buckled. He caught her. She jerked away, then straightened slowly, like a woman learning how to stand again. She said nothing. Not a word. He gestured to the cabin. "You can take the bed." Still nothing. He lit the stove, made coffee so bitter it tasted like apology, and set a tin cup on the table. She didn't touch it. He set down bread and butter. She didn't look. He left. Slept in the barn with the mare, the bottle unopened beside him like a loaded gun. Morning brought a thin mist and aching quiet. He stood at the window of the barn, watching her through the cracked glass. She was kneeling in the dirt behind the house, hands digging slow, deliberate. He thought maybe she was planting something. Then he realized she was burying ashes, a handful at a time. A small pile of charred fabric, blue, frayed at the hem. He remembered that dress. Jude turned away. That evening he brought out clean linens, folded badly but honest. He left them on the porch. She took them, didn't say thank you. He didn't expect her to. On the third night it rained. Thunder low like morning drums. He woke to find the cabin window cracked open, light glowing faint. He approached slow. Through the pane he saw her standing in front of the hearth, back to the fire, shoulders bare. The sack was gone. Her hair had been cut short, chopped and jagged, uneven at the nape, like someone had done it quick in panic. Or punishment. His heart stopped. He saw the curve of her neck, the slope of her shoulder, and there, just beneath the bone, a scar. A small, pale line shaped like a crescent moon. He had kissed it once, drunk on new love and river air. He had traced it with his thumb the first night they'd shared a bed. He told her it made her look like she'd survived something and come out golden. Well, the name clanged through his chest like a bell. He staggered back from the window as if burned. The rain fell harder. It soaked his shirt, his boots, his bones. He stood in it like a man just dug from the earth, unable to move, afraid to breathe. Inside the cabin, she moved away from the fire and sat down at the table. Her face turned slowly toward the window. He didn't think she could see him. But her lips moved. And through the hiss of rain and regret, he swore he heard her whisper, "You still don't know what you did." Jude didn't sleep the rest of that night. He paced the barn floor, boards creaking under his boots, the air thick with hay dust and storm breath. The mare shifted in her stall, unsettled by his restlessness. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper, then stopped altogether, leaving behind the hollow hush of land holding its breath. He waited until the cabin light went dark. By morning he had convinced himself he was wrong. That the scar was coincidence, that the shape of her shoulders was memory playing cruel tricks. But the lie unraveled the moment he saw her at the water pump, sleeves rolled, hair dripping from the bucket's splash. It was her. Well, and she hadn't said a word. She saw him watching but didn't flinch. Just kept pumping water, slow and even, her body stiff with defiance. She was thinner now, cheekbones sharpened like flint, and the blue in her eyes, once full of mischief and moonlight, had dulled to something unreadable. He stepped forward, unsure what to say. "Willa." She froze. Her hand clenched the pump's handle, knuckles white. She didn't turn. "You," he swallowed. "You're alive." Still she said nothing. He took another step. "You could have written. Sent it. How I looked." Now she turned. Her face, clean and calm, held no anger. Only vacancy. Like something had been hollowed out and swept clean. "No," she said quietly. "You didn't." And then she walked past him, bucket in hand, water sloshing at her feet. That night he tried again. He cooked stew. Badly. It burned at the bottom, but he served it anyway, placing a bowl at her side of the table. She sat across from him, eating in silence, her spoon scraping slow and mechanical. Jude watched the curve of her jaw, the old scar at her temple from when she'd fallen off the hayloft years ago, laughing. He remembered the way she used to curl against him in sleep, breathing slow and sure, as if she trusted him with everything. Now her body remained tight, distant even in stillness. Her presence felt like an accusation. He wanted to ask where she'd gone. What had happened? If she had buried the child behind the barn, the one they never spoke of after that stormy night, the one lost when he was too drunk to help and too proud to grieve. But the words wouldn't come. His mouth worked around silence like it was a spoonful of dirt. He found her once at dusk, standing in the field with her hands outstretched. The fog clung to the ground, curling around her ankles like smoke. She was humming, barely audible. A lullaby. He hadn't heard it in years, not since that winter they'd lost the calf and sang to stay warm in the dark. She stopped when she noticed him. He took off his hat. "I didn't mean," he began. Her voice was soft. "You meant every word, Jude." "No. I was drunk. That's what scared me most," she said, turning away. "That you only told the truth when you drank." He stood in that cold quiet as she walked back to the cabin, her footprints filling with mist. The next day he found her hanging laundry, rags mostly, worn things patched over twice. He brought out a box. Inside, her old shawl, the locket with the dried forget-me-not, and a journal he never dared read. She didn't look at him. "I kept him," he said, placing it gently on the porch rail. Didn't know why. She didn't touch it. That night he drank. He sat on the porch with a half-empty bottle, watching the stars blink through cloud trails. His guilt pooled around his boots like spilled oil. He remembered the last time he'd seen her standing in this same yard, lips trembling, hair loose, voice cracking. "You drink too much, Jude," she'd said back then. "And you love too little." He'd laughed. God help him, he'd laughed in her face. She left 2 days later and he'd let her. Now he watched her silhouette move through the window, quiet as snowfall. And for the first time in years he didn't want to drink to forget. He wanted to remember. In the morning he rose early and began repairing the roof. His back ached and his hands bled from nails rusted into place. She watched him through the window but never came out. Still, each day he did something. Fixed the gate hinge, patched the porch boards, dug out the old well. Every gesture was a confession. One afternoon he returned from chopping firewood to find the stew pot on the stove already warm. No words. Just the warmth. A beginning. He tried to give her the bedroom key one night. "It's yours again." She shook her head. "It was never the walls that kept me out." That silence between them thickened with each breath. And still she stayed. One Sunday they rode into town together. Her face was covered by a faded bonnet, but folks recognized her by the way Jude walked beside her, hat in hand, head down. Sheriff Hollis nodded once but said nothing. Emmeline Rose raised her brows but offered a loaf of bread all the same. Jude saw the whispers ripple like wind through wheat. She came back. She must be desperate. Or broken. They passed Briggs, who sneered. Was cheaper to buy her than say sorry, ha, Carter? Jude flinched, but Willa didn't. She held her head high, stepped into the mercantile and began bartering for cloth. He watched her argue gently with the clerk, her hands folding and unfolding with grace. She wasn't who she'd been. She was quieter, firmer. A woman who'd learned to survive on silence, who had rebuilt herself in the ashes of absence. And still she had not left. That night she sat at the table as he sharpened the knife. "I found something," she said. He looked up. She placed a cloth bundle on the table. Slowly unwrapped it. Inside, a bloodied petticoat, faded blue. Tiny hand-stitched flowers near the hem. His breath caught. "I buried her behind the barn," she whispered. 3 days alone. I dug through frost and screamed your name until I couldn't any more." He stared at the cloth like it might crawl off the table. "She had your eyes," Willa said. "But she never opened them." The pain landed heavy, thick and old and true. It knocked the wind from him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know. I wasn't." "You weren't there," she finished gently. "That's all." He sat down hard, bones hollow. "I thought you hated me." "I did. But hate fades. Shame doesn't." She stood and left the bundle where it lay. He reached for it with shaking hands. Her stitches were neat, even. A woman trying to keep order while everything else unraveled. He spent that night beneath the stars, the petticoat beside him, rain soaking through his shirt like baptism. The next morning the air smelled of pine and wild sage. Willa was already outside feeding the chickens. He brought her coffee, black, bitter, just how she used to drink it. She took it without a word. "You could leave now," he said. "I could. But you're still here." She didn't look at him, just sipped slowly. "Maybe I'm waiting," she said. "For what?" "For you to remember what love feels like." He wanted to reach for her hand. He didn't. That night she sat closer. The fire between them cracked gently, not loud enough to cover their breathing. Outside, coyotes cried into the night, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. 1, 2. When he rose to stoke the fire, he paused by her chair. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not giving up on me completely." She looked up then, eyes gleaming in firelight. "I did," she said. "You waited for the blow. But something brought me back." He nodded, throat tight. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of yellowed paper. "I found your letter. The one you never sent." He froze. She placed it in his hand, fingers brushing lightly. "I kept mine too," she said. "But I never mailed it." He stared at the letter, his handwriting, shaky but clear. "I'm sorry. If you come back, I'll listen this time." As she stood to go inside, she paused in the doorway. "I don't need promises, Jude." He looked up. "I need truth." Then she vanished into the dark. The fire hissed low. Wind rattled the shutter once. He unfolded the letter and read it under the stars. It ended with one line, "I bought a girl for $6 today, Willa. And I think she might have been the only thing I ever loved right." The first apple seed Jude planted with his bare hands sank into cold dirt beneath a sky bruised with spring clouds. The orchard had long since withered to nothing but roots and dust, but she'd once said she dreamed of red apples in autumn, the kind that left sweetness on the tongue and juice on the chin. He didn't ask her if she remembered. He didn't need to. Instead, he worked quietly, sun on his neck, dirt under his nails, placing each seed like a prayer into the ground, covering it with hope and the weight of his guilt. Willa watched from the porch. She sat on the step with mending in her lap, fingers moving steadily, eyes unreadable beneath her wide-brimmed bonnet. Some days she watched him with the faintest softness. Other days she looked past him like he was a fence post or distant mountain, there but unworthy of remark. They shared the cabin now, if not the same room. She kept to the space with the quilts, the soft things. He slept near the stove, a blanket folded across his chest, dreaming of things he once ruined with silence. Some evenings she sang, barely audible, threading old hymns into her sewing. Jude never asked her to stop. He only listened, still as stone, like a man who'd found the voice of God in a woman's broken lullaby. He never saw her cry, but he saw her kneel. Late one morning, after laying out the final row of seeds, Jude rounded the barn and saw her behind it, barefoot, bent low to the earth. She wasn't praying. She was digging. He said nothing, just stood beneath the cottonwood tree whose limbs cracked in the wind like old bones. Her shoulders rose and fell with every movement, steady, deliberate. Next to her, a small pile of soot-black cloth, and beside that, a box. He recognized it. The box they'd once used to keep baby things. Booties stitched with red thread, a cradle cross made of iron nails, the name Lila burned gently into a strip of oak. Willa's fingers shook as she lowered each item into the hole. Not as ritual but as release. She paused with the final piece, half of a bonnet scorched at the edge. She didn't kiss it, just held it to her chest, then let go. Jude stepped back before she turned. He'd never felt more like a thief in his own land. He didn't go near the graves again that week, though at night he dreamed of tiny hands and a voice he'd never heard calling Papa, into a world that had no answer. That silence, the one between father and soil, would never quite loosen from his ribs. The following day Willa brought in apples. Not fresh. Withered, sour ones from the market in town. But she baked them all the same, filling the house with a smell he hadn't tasted in 4 years. She placed one on his plate without looking at him, her movements precise. Jude chewed slowly, not for hunger, but for memory. The last time he'd tasted her cooking, the sheriff had come knocking. Back then Jude had refused to answer the door. Too much whiskey in his blood. Too much shame blooming in his chest. He hadn't said goodbye. He hadn't said anything. This time the apple was tart. But he finished it anyway. Willa sat across from him, folding napkins into perfect triangles. Her eyes flicked up once, and for the first time he saw the edge of a smile. Not kindness. Not forgiveness. Something simpler. Recognition. In town, word had spread that the ghost woman was back. Briggs had said it loud at the mercantile, where Willa stood with thread in her hand and coin in her palm. Didn't think someone could walk all the way from hell barefoot and still make it back, he sneered. Willa turned slowly. Her voice was quiet. Better barefoot in hell than full-bellied and hollow. No one laughed. Briggs spat and left, red-faced. Emmeline rose, half hidden by shelves of soap and oil, met her eyes and said nothing. But when Willa turned to leave, a wrapped parcel sat in her basket. Sugar. And cinnamon. That evening, Jude found her outside with her hair unbound, brushing it in the moonlight. You never used to let it down, he said. I never used to have anyone watching, she replied. He didn't know whether to stay or leave, so he simply stood there, hat in hand. Why the apples? He asked. She tied her hair back slowly, movements fluid. You forgot how they taste. I'm trying to remember, he said. That's not the same as never forgetting. The night crept in cool and low, drawing out scents from the soil, apple peels, ash, tobacco. Somewhere an owl called. Farther still, coyotes echoed their haunting laughter into the hills. The next day he found her journal under the floorboard. Not hidden. Just left. He didn't open it. He wrapped it in a handkerchief and placed it on her pillow. That night she left a slice of pie beside his bed. Neither said anything. The chasm between them wasn't just time. It was everything unsaid, everything undone, everything left to rot and fester in the wounds of absence. But something was shifting. He caught her humming again. Not a hymn this time, but the song they once sang on the way to Denver when their wagon lost a wheel and they walked the last 3 miles hand in hand. He found himself fixing things he didn't even know were broken. Hinges, doorknobs, shutters. Every nail was a word he didn't say when she needed it. One evening, as golden light poured through the window like honey, Willa stood beside him and held out a spool of thread. He looked at it. "For what?" he asked. "You patched the house," she said. "I'll patch you." He chuckled, but the sound caught in his throat like a prayer too long forgotten. They sat together that night, close enough that their shoulders touched, though neither acknowledged it. He told her of the orchard dream, of planting trees that had outlived both of them. She nodded. "You planted too late," she said gently. "I know. But you still planted." Outside, wind rattled the bare branches. She leaned forward, lit a candle, and placed it in the window. "For her?" he asked. "For us," she replied. Later that week he came back from the creek trail carrying something strange. It was a ribbon. Faded lavender, knotted at one end. Caught in a thorn bush. He handed it to her with both palms open. Her lips parted, breath catching. That was hers. He nodded. "I think she wanted it found," he said. Willa took it, pressing it to her heart. They didn't speak for a long time. But she didn't walk away. That night, thunder rolled in low and slow, and rain began to fall soft as breath on the rooftop. They sat by the fire again, closer than before. Jude watched her fingers trace the flame's reflection in her teacup. "You still wear the ring?" he whispered. "I never took it off." "Why?" She looked at him, then down at her hand. "Because even when I hated you, I still hoped you'd change." His throat burned. "I'm trying," he said. "I know." She stood to leave, then paused. "You know the baby had a name?" He shook his head. "Lila." He closed his eyes. "Beautiful." She was. And then she was gone. The candle flickered once, then held. Jude stayed there till it burned out. At dawn, the first apple sprout broke through the earth. The rain had softened the soil enough to let life breathe again. He stood over it, hat in hand, eyes full of something that looked like reverence. He didn't call her to come see. Instead, he went to the shed, pulled out the old crib frame, and began sanding it down, careful not to strip the name carved into its edge. That evening, as the sun bled across the land in streaks of pink and tangerine, he placed the finished frame at the base of the growing tree. Willa joined him without a word. Together they looked at it. A tiny grave beneath, a small sprout above, and between them, a ribbon tied to the branch, fluttering like a heartbeat in the wind. She slipped her hand into his. And for once he didn't let go. But when he woke the next morning, the crib was empty. And she was gone again. The day Willa walked back into town alone, the wind held its breath. It was Sunday, and the bells were already ringing when her boots touched the hardpan road. She wore a plain dress the color of dried moss, the one she'd been auctioned in, still mended at the hem with uneven thread. No bonnet. No gloves. Her shoulders squared against the weight of staring eyes. Behind curtains and door frames the town watched. A woman returning from disgrace was always more interesting than the preacher's sermon. More than once, voices had asked how long she'd stay this time, and whether Jude Carter had bought her silence alongside her shame. She didn't knock on doors. She didn't stop to speak. She just walked straight down the center of town like the ground had been stitched for her souls alone. Inside the chapel, the organ groaned with the opening hymn. Willa stepped through the back doors as voices lifted into the rafters. Heads turned. Whispers rippled like wind in wheat. She didn't sit. She stood near the entry, back straight, hands clasped in front of her. The preacher's voice faltered but pressed on. Jude entered half a minute later, his boots quieter than usual, hat in hand. He didn't sit either. He stood beside her, leaving a sliver of space between them. Not enough for gossip. Not enough for comfort. But enough for choice. After the sermon, no one approached. Not Emmeline Rose, not Sheriff Hollis, not even the widow Marnie who used to bring Willa pies when she was first married. The town didn't quite know what to do with a woman who returned from the dead and kept breathing. Outside, the sun bore down mercilessly. Willa squinted into it. "You didn't have to come," she murmured. "I did," Jude replied. "For me. For myself." She nodded once, then walked away. Jude followed, not because he was welcome but because he needed to see it through. That afternoon, Willa posted a note to the chapel board. 3 lines written in careful script. Offering stitching and mending. No charity accepted. Payment by trade or truth. Signed only, W. Carter. By dusk, someone had left a basket of potatoes on the porch. The next day, a bundle of thread. And 2 days later a pair of boots, men's too small for Jude, too worn for pride. She patched the sole anyway. The women didn't speak much to her, not yet. But the gestures had begun. Small, quiet ones that echoed louder than any sermon. The men watched more cautiously. Briggs, emboldened by his pipe in the company of others, said aloud near the livery, "She's walking like she ain't got chains on no more. Somebody remind her what she came from." Jude heard it. But he didn't answer with fists. He simply met Briggs's gaze and said, "You ever bury a child, Briggs?" The man turned pale and spat into the dust, retreating behind the safety of his fence line. In the evenings, Willa sat on the porch with her sewing basket while Jude carved fence posts. They rarely spoke, but the silence between them had softened. Some days it held the weight of what was lost. Other days it shimmered with what could still grow. The apple sprout by the barn had grown taller, 2 leaves stretching upward, bold in the morning light. Willa began tending it herself, watering it in the early dawn when no one was watching. But Jude watched anyway, from the barn, from the porch, from the shadows of his own reckoning. He remembered the night he'd left her. He remembered her screams. And worse, he remembered ignoring them. He had drunk himself past hearing, past caring. When he woke the next morning, the house was cold and hollow. Her shawl gone. Her scent already fading from the sheets. Now he watched her exist not like a ghost, but like fire that refused to go out. She didn't speak of Lila again. But one night, Jude heard her whisper the name beneath her breath, like a prayer meant only for the earth. The following morning he went into town and bought seeds. Apple, lavender, marigold. He planted them with his own hands around the grave she had dug behind the barn. No marker. Just blossoms and breath. Sheriff Hollis came by the next week. He stood at the porch with his thumbs in his belt, expression unreadable. "Afternoon, Carter." Jude nodded. The sheriff looked past him at Willa, who stood at the hearth stitching a small torn apron. "She's legal now?" "She's always been my wife. I mean by paper." Jude opened the cabin door wider. "You want to ask her yourself?" The sheriff didn't move. Then said, "Town's stirring. You bought her at auction. Some think that's unseemly." Jude's jaw worked. "You were there. Didn't know who she was at the time. And if you had?" Sheriff Hollis shrugged. "Would have asked why a woman tied to a wagon post had your last name." Willa stepped forward, wiping her hands on her skirt. "I tied myself," she said. The sheriff blinked. "I chose that place," she added, "because I wanted to see what he'd do when he wasn't drunk." Jude's breath caught. He hadn't known. "I needed to know if he'd recognize what he broke." The sheriff looked between them. "And did he?" "I'm still here," she said softly. With a slow nod, Hollis tipped his hat and turned back toward the road. Jude stared at her as she retreated to her mending. You chose that spot?" he asked, voice raw. She didn't look at him. "I had nothing else to lose. But I still had my name. And you wore it like rope." "Yes," she said. "But it held." He sank onto the steps, elbows on his knees, heart rattling in his chest like an old gate in wind. That night they shared a pot of stew in silence. But she let him pour the broth. Let him break the bread. And when she stood to clean the bowls, she let her fingers brush his. Only for a moment. But he noticed. The next morning the church bell rang early. A wedding. Someone else's joy. Willa paused on the porch to listen, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. "You ever think about starting over?" Jude asked gently. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "Starting over means pretending the first part didn't happen." He swallowed. "Then what do you call this?" She turned to him. "Something still burning," she said. "And not yet out." That evening he found her behind the barn again. But she wasn't burying anything. She was digging something up. A cloth bundle wrapped in oilskin. Dirt-streaked but dry inside. He approached, kneeling beside her. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside, baby shoes. Tiny, white, still tied together with blue ribbon. He reached for them, hands trembling. "Lila's," she whispered. Then after a pause, "I want to hang them on the tree." He looked at her. "Are you sure?" She nodded. And as the last light of day slipped behind the hills, they stood beneath the apple sprout, now stronger, its first buds unfurling. Willa tied the shoes to the lowest branch. They fluttered in the wind like wings. The town would talk. They always did. But for once Willa didn't care. She had placed her loss in the open, hung it like a flag of mourning, and dared the world to say her grief didn't matter. Jude stood beside her, not speaking, just breathing. As if finally he understood what it meant to carry something together. The wind picked up, warm and golden. And from down the road, a wagon appeared. Its wheels creaked. Its horses slowed. And at the reins, a stranger with a paper in hand and a scar across his face. Willa's eyes narrowed. "I know that man," she said. And the cold returned to her voice. The wagon rolled to a stop in the red dust just past the fence line, its wheels still ticking faintly as the stranger stepped down. He wore a duster stained with travel, boots caked in mud, and a revolver low on his hip, though his hand didn't rest on it. His face was older than his body, creased, worn, and a scar cut through his brow like a broken promise. Willa didn't blink. She stood still beside the apple sapling, the baby shoes swaying gently in the wind. Jude stepped half in front of her, hand at his side but not reaching for anything. The man tipped his hat. Didn't expect to find the bride still breathing. His voice was smooth but too clean for the filth riding under it. Willa's jaw tightened. "Your papers won't hold here." He stepped closer, unfolding the yellowed document. "Sheriff signed this 5 months ago. Ownership of debt. And of body. Signed over to me." Jude stepped forward now. "That's my wife." She was sold for debt when you were too drunk to notice." The words hit like a slap. Jude didn't flinch, but something shifted in his stance. Less shame now, more fury. Willa didn't look at Jude. She looked only at the stranger. "You paid $6 for my silence." He grinned, showing teeth. "And you gave me one night before you vanished." Jude's hands curled into fists. "You touched her?" "No," Willa said calmly, eyes still locked with the man's. "He tried." The stranger's smile faltered. "She slit his cheek with a broken jar," she added, voice flat. "While he bled, I climbed out the back of the wagon." The scar. Jude stared at it now, the pale line from temple to cheek. Rage flared behind his ribs like gunpowder meeting flame. The man's eyes flicked between them. "Sheriff says she's still property." "She's not," Jude growled. The man smirked, unfolding a second paper. "Well, then the sheriff's word don't mean much out here, huh? Maybe I'd take her anyway. Who's gonna stop me?" Willa moved before Jude could. She stepped in front of the apple tree and raised something from beneath her skirt. A hammer. Not a gun. Not a blade. Just the tool she used to fix the porch, to mend what time and weather tore down. The man laughed. "You gonna fix me, girl?" "No," she said. "Just remind you I built things stronger than you." And then she swung. It caught his hand as he reached for her, breaking bone with a sound like snapping branches. He howled and stumbled back, cradling his wrist, the paper falling into the dirt. Jude grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wagon's wheel. Dust billowed. The horses screamed. Jude's voice came out low, shaking. "You came here with a lie. You leave without your pride." The man spat, blood in his teeth. "She's worth nothing now. You'll learn that." Jude leaned in. "She's worth a tree, a grave, a child's name, and a second chance. You're worth less than the rope you should have swung from." He let him go. The man staggered backward, then climbed up onto the wagon, cradling his hand. Willa didn't speak again. She just watched as the wheels turned and the stranger vanished back into the horizon he'd crawled from. They stood there for a long time, not speaking. Wind caught the baby shoes and made them dance. Jude turned to her. "He's gone." "He won't stay gone," she said. "Then we'll be ready." She looked at him, truly looked for the first time in weeks. "You believe me now?" "I believe I failed you," he said, voice steady. "But I also believe I still want to build what I broke." Willa looked down at her hands. Dirt-streaked. Calloused. "I don't want to be pitted." "You're not." She met his gaze again. "Then don't make promises. Just plant roots." He nodded. Later, after the sun had dipped low and the porch light flickered on, Jude opened the back of the wagon the man had left behind. Inside was nothing. No bedroll. No food. Just a torn ribbon. The same shade as the one Willa had tied in Lila's cradle before she left that winter. He brought it to her wordlessly. She held it between her fingers for a long time. Then she smiled, not softly but with a kind of certainty. "I'm still her mother," she said, "even if no one saw her live." "And I'm still yours," Jude said quietly. "If you'll have me." Willa didn't answer. But she hung the ribbon on the apple tree beside the shoes. And then she turned to him and for the first time in years, stepped willingly into his arms.